Hello, friends, and welcome to what is probably, full disclosure, my very favorite lecture of the semester, the first full phase of American modernism. So, to start today, I want to go back to our web that I've shown you a couple of times now, and I know it's confusing and convoluted, but again, I want to just hammer home how interconnected these artists were. So, while in the past, in the 19th century, we talked about American artists being somewhat isolated from what was happening in Europe unless they went over there, like John Singer Sargent or Mary Cassatt, here we have artists who have gone there, come back, they're writing, they're sending journals, they're seeing representations or reproductions of other artworks. And so I think it's really helpful to just be aware of how aware they were of each other at this point. So let's zoom in and see some of the names that we're going to be talking about today. We spent a good bit of time talking about Marcel Duchamp earlier this semester, and again, you can't really overstate his importance. But so today, I want to talk a little bit about his friend, Joseph Stella. We're going to start by talking about Stella. And I want you to pay attention to see how, if you see Stella's name on the middle left of the screen here, how he is connected to the Italian futurists. So I want us to remember that because Joseph Stella is actually an Italian immigrant to the United States. And so there's some ties here that I think are really important for us to pay attention to. We're also going to be talking to Alfred Stieglitz, and you see here that he is a red name, and that means that he is basically a very important player, a big hub for modernism in the United States. And so a lot of artists are going to learn about modernism, and the public's going to learn about modernism through Alfred Stieglitz in particular. So along with that, we're going to talk about Georgia O'Keeffe. We're going to talk about Marston Hartley, and we're going to be talking about Charles Demuth, who, sadly enough, didn't make it to this web, and I didn't write this web, so I can't blame myself here. I'm just going to take it up with MoMA. Anyway, so let's start with Stella. And here you can see a photograph of Stella and Marcel Duchamp sitting together, taken by Man Ray, and there's a self-portrait of Man Ray above Duchamp, and so that's why he calls it Three Heads. But so Stella is an Italian immigrant. He's been in Paris. He's sat in the salons of Gertrude Stein. He's seen the shows at the Paris modern exhibitions. He saw the Italian Futurist show in Paris, and he's back in New York, and he is really been changed and marked by what he saw in New York. And I think it's also important to remember how influential Duchamp was and how he and Stella were buddies and that they would talk about artistic ideas. And remember that Stella was, according to the folklore, very instrumental in helping Duchamp steal Fountain back from the exhibition, right? And that taking it to Alfred Stieglitz to have to be photographed. So let's take a look here and see what Stella's own artwork looked like and how he was really shifted by the modernist movement. This is maybe his most famous work of art. It's called Battle of Lights, Coney Island, Mardi Gras. And it was a work that he was working on from about 1913 to 1914. And I hope that you can see some of the similarities between his work and the Italian Futurists' work. And that's why he's kind of called the American Italian Futurists. But this work of art became infamous, right? Almost as soon as it hit the scene, and people were talking about how inscrutable it was, how little sense it made. You can see that he even gets into his own bit of satire that he's depicted in a cartoon in the New York Post, where he appears with Walt Kuhn, Walter Pack, and Arthur Davies, if you remember some of the major forces behind the Armory show. So these guys were kind of synonymous with modernism at this point. And here you see Joseph Stella in his big jocose body with his Coney Island Mardi Gras being spoofed behind. So this was pretty well established in the public eye as something that was really outlandish. But so what do we see here? What does the title tell us? Battle of Lights, Coney Island, Mardi Gras. So we know that Joseph Stella had traveled to Europe. He had experienced a lot of the currents that were going through modern art at this time, Cubism, Futurism, and he comes back. And one night he decides to ride the bus from Manhattan to Coney Island to go to this major theme park, right? And as he's arriving, he's amazed by what he's seeing as far as electricity. And so what he does is take these tenets that he learned in Europe from the Cubists and the Futurists and take them and apply them to what he's seeing in the entertainment industry in New York City and America, and what technological and mechanical advances that happened there. So he actually writes about this, and he says, steel and electricity had created a new world. A new drama had surged from the violation of the darkness at night by the violent blaze of electricity, and a new polyphony was ringing all around with scintillating, highly colored lights. So first of all, think about how this language that's used by Stella is so strikingly similar to what the Futurists had said in their manifesto. And you think about the novelty of what he had experienced by going to Coney Island at night, by seeing all of this electricity, all of this sound, roller coasters, music. You know, he says the word new 3 times in that quote, and he talks about the kind of sensorial overload, how dynamic what he was seeing, and he even uses the term violent, right? Talking about how jarring this experience was to him. So if you start looking through here, as I hope that we've been kind of taught to do by this point, that you can begin to parse together the different elements of the scene. At the very center, you see the tower, and this was the Tower of Lights called the Luna Tower that Coney Island was famous for. And then you can begin to see maybe elements of roller coasters twirling through, lights, and then at the very bottom, all of these kind of fragmented black and colored shapes. Those are the frenzied crowds of people enjoying the nighttime revelry. And if you start to look, you can see different letters coming through. That would be letters from the signage as well. So park, this is a theme park, right? Calm, this is, there are different words that we can pull here, but this was something, as an Italian, he'd be talking about commedia, the comedy of what he's seeing. But notice that if you look at some studies that he made, he did a number of studies for this particular painting, and the futurist component here is really key. Remember how the futurists use force lines to denote movement? You can see that especially here in this futurist composition, where he's also experimenting with the kind of fragmentation of light and color and movement that he will ultimately come to put at play in the Battle of Lights, Coney Island at Mardi Gras. So you can imagine that maybe the American public, who is not used to seeing works of Cubism, not used to seeing works of Futurism, they hadn't yet made it over to this soil, this would be completely disorienting. And so you have all of these colors, all of these shapes, all the chaos just running back and forth to each other. And if you look about middle, slightly left of the letters C-O-M, you see F-E-L-T. Spelling felt, right? That was probably part of Feltman's hot dogs or corny dogs. But what we can say is that he's pulling that to kind of tell us, signal to us that this is part of the felt experience of what it's like to be a bystander in the pandemonium of a nighttime revelry at Coney Island. And if he's telling us too that it's during Mardi Gras, and so this would be a very much a party scene. You have people that are enjoying Fat Tuesday before the Lenten sober season commences. And so this is basically, he's telling us that this is the party scene at its fullest. And he's really just trying to communicate that, right? By having all of this fragmentation, all of this movement, he's trying to communicate this felt experience. So this is pretty much at the beginning of his career and what brought him the most fame, the most notoriety in some cases. But this connection with the Italian futurists and trying to convey the idea of movement and time and sound and smells and sights all together in one two-dimensional static canvas. But I want to show you how he begins to take these ideas and really make them his own as he moves forward in his career. So this particular artwork is called The Voice of the City of New York Interpreted from 1920 to 1922. And if you're looking at this, I want us to just start by thinking about what does it remind you of, just thinking about the shapes. So take a minute and look at the overall composition. There are 5 different panels, and the one in the center is larger than the other 4. Now, Stella was a Italian, a Catholic, and he had been raised in the church. And so being raised in Italy, he would be very familiar with the history of Renaissance altarpieces. And so if you look at this, I think he's trying to make this kind of visual connection first and foremost with the history of altarpieces and with kind of trying to convey a very spiritual idea. But let's walk through this a little bit before we get into that. Now, looking through this is a really large set of canvases. It's called a polyptych, meaning it's multiple canvases put together in one setting. Like an altarpiece can be a diptych, a triptych, or a polyptych, and we have a polyptych here. So he's even done, if we go back to our image, let's see. Here, he even includes the traditional predella, which is the bottom panel. That's the kind of flat register at the bottom. He's really trying to clue into you that he's alluding to a Renaissance altar panel. So why is he doing that? What is he trying to think about as he's creating this particular image? If you're looking at this is a larger than life canvas. You actually have to physically move to see each individual scene, right? So you start at the left where you see this scene of the Port of New York, and then you move in from left to right and you see the Great White Way number 1, and then in the center the prow, and then on the right, stepping forward to the right, Great White Way number 2, and the final scene is the bridge. And so what he's doing is really taking you on a walking tour of New York from the east side of the city to the west side of the city. And so you have these kind of elements here, and along the bottom you see these lights. That is to kind of denote the idea of the subway as it's moving through the city as well. But you think about, at the port, you have these kind of radiating lines and orbs that may remind you of the kind of foghorns that might be going off, and the sounds and sights of being there as the ships are rolling in. And then as you move right and you see the Great White Way number 1 and also the Great White Way number 2, you might think about Broadway and how Broadway was so wildly illuminated with the different signs and the different lights. And you can see these lights bisecting each other, crossing across the canvas. There are different elements that repeat, giving a kind of visual rhythm that you might think about Broadway as being associated with musicals and shows. And so all of that, this is very spectacular, right? But I want us to pay attention to the very central panel. And if you look at the very center point of the central panel, there should be a building that is familiar to you as you look down, as it moves from about the center to the bottom third of the canvas. That is the Flatiron Building, right? And so a lot of people had made allusions to the Flatiron Building as a prow of a ship, almost slicing through lower Manhattan. And what you see as you begin to look around are all of these buildings, these skyscrapers that denote modernity. They give you a sense that this is a modern city on the move and that you are walking through and experiencing. And then as you move forward to the second white way, and then the final scene of being on the bridge. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, and there's a very much a kind of Gothic cathedral architecture to the Brooklyn Bridge, and we'll talk about that in a second. But that closes out the scene of this kind of religious altarpiece. So, taking all this together, we see the sights and how he tries to interpret the sounds of New York as you're walking through and experiencing what it's like to be on a foot tour of Manhattan, right? He was famous for his walks. He walked everywhere, and he once said, "New York is my wife. I will always come back to her." So he had an intense love and affection for this city. So if we're thinking about that and we're looking at these different panels, I want us to also go back to the title. It's called The Voice of the City of New York Interpreted. What does that even mean? I think in a lot of ways, we have to keep going back to the shape that he's chosen for this as reminiscent of an altarpiece, right? You have throughout history this idea that spiritual beings and spiritual experiences need interpretation. And so you have historically prophets and those who hear these spiritual messages and hear these ideas and are able to interpret them and communicate them to the followers or to the public in general. And I think that's something that we're noticing here is that he sees this city. I mean, keep in mind he immigrated to this city at 18, so he had never experienced anything like this as a boy from kind of provincial Italy outside Naples. He had never experienced any kind of urban environment like this. And so he has this kind of epiphanic moment or this out of body experience as he's walking through the city, and he feels the city as almost this new divine force, that there's a kind of energy pulsating through it, and he's trying to communicate that to you. He sees himself as a kind of artist prophet, taking this experience of modernity, of being in the modern city, and translating for you as the viewer to see and experience on your own. And going back to the central panel, in most altar panels, what is the central panel reserved for but the most important religious scene, whether it's a crucifixion or an image of Mary and the Christ child, something like that. In the center here, you have the skyscrapers, and the skyscrapers are kind of ethereal, floating out of this blue abyss, and they're crowned by beams of light. And so it's this image of progress and with a kind of celestial quality, almost as though that they are blessed by divinity themselves, right? One thing I want us to talk about today, especially, is if you look at that center panel and you see on the far left side at the top of this, you have this long vertical line. That's probably a smokestack. And one of the things I want us to think about as we're looking at this particular period in American art is that a smokestack is not, when you see that in paintings, it's not pollution. They're not signifying that. When smoke is entering into the sky, that is a sign of progress. That is a sign of industrial prowess. That's a sign of hope and an auspicious future, so to speak. So here, I think including that, it's really key for Stella that this is an emblem of a city that's on the rise, literally and quite figuratively. And he's saying that there's something religious about the experience of being in the modern city. And I think you can see this throughout his later work. He's going to return to images of the Brooklyn Bridge just by itself over and over again in his later career. And here you can kind of see those same ideas, right? By having focusing on the architecture of the Brooklyn Bridge, the Gothic arches, that there's this religious connotation there, with the cables of the Brooklyn Bridge almost seeming like these long sweeping arcs, horns from the sky, angels' trumpets, I've heard people describe them. And then the city that behind the bridge that you see through the two openings of the bridge there's not a recognizable building. You don't see the Flatiron, you don't see the Chrysler building, you don't see any of the famous buildings that New York was becoming known for at this time, but you see a kind of ethereal, again, prismatic city shimmering in the light, giving you this sense that the modern city is a truly celestial place, and a place where religious experiences can be had. And I think that's really key and something to think about, because modernism, especially modernism in the United States, is so often maligned as, or not maligned, but definitely described as overtly secular, having nothing to do with the spiritual. And I think that's definitely not the case. And we're going to see this over and over again today, that there are different ways that these artists are trying to convey a new kind of spiritual experience that might not be Christian, it might not be tied with any institutional religion, but this idea that there's something ultimately very moving and soul shaking about the experience of modern life, especially the experience of modern life in the city. So let's take this moment and this idea, and let's go back to our idea that, or our notion that Stella and Marcel Duchamp were friends, and that they took the fountain to Alfred Stieglitz. And I want to focus on Alfred Stieglitz for a little bit, because he really took this idea of a kind of new spiritual experience in the city to its fullest extent. And you can't really, again, overstate how important he was. He is a very important figure in American modernism. He was a photographer, and a very, very successful one. And he's going to work for years to promote photography as much of an art form as painting, sculpture, or drawing. But what I think that's relevant for us today is the fact that he was a kind of center pole of sorts of the tent of modernism in New York. He had his pulse on what was going on in Europe. And here I'm showing you again the image I've shown you before of the Flatiron Building, and how he started off his career as a photographer in the pictorialist tradition, where he's taking a photograph and he's manipulating it to look more like a painting, basically increasing the art quotient of a painting. But here, I want you to see that he was also a gallery owner. He ran a number of different galleries throughout his career. He gave Matisse his first show in the United States, and you can see here that he also did an African show in the early teens, and he published a magazine or a journal called 291 that introduced modern artists and their theories to anybody that was interested. He published excerpts from Kandinsky's book concerning the spiritual and art, and so on. So he's really trying to convey these ideas to the public. But he also worked tirelessly to help American artists make it. And he's criticized because he basically only helps a small number. He has a few artists that he really champions. But I think, it's worth noting that the artists that he did champion are artists that we still talk about today. And so here at the very bottom image, you can see Georgia O'Keeffe's works hanging in his galleries, and you can see I should have said earlier, that's Stieglitz himself on the left. And he would provide stipends so that the artists could live and not be totally dependent on selling their work. And he would sell their work to both the wealthy and to people who couldn't pay that much but truly loved and understood the work. So he saw himself, and he writes about this, he saw himself as a kind of evangelist for avant-garde art in the United States. And he's probably really one of the reasons that it began to catch on for both artists and the public in the United States at this time. So here you can see his 291 gallery. This is his first gallery space on Fifth Avenue, and Fifth Avenue is one of the ritzier sections of New York. And here is a reconstruction of what this would have looked like. But if he saw himself as this kind of evangelist of the new art, and saw his galleries as a place to get away from the hustle and bustle of the city, I want you to pay attention to how he designed his galleries. Think about how art has traditionally been shown, right? And here's this image you've seen before by Samuel Morse of the Gallery of the Louvre. What is he done differently? Take a moment to kind of look at how he has put together the gallery space and how he is exhibiting the artwork. First and foremost, the artworks are spaced farther apart. There is a sense that you can get up close and be rather intimate with the artworks. You can take a moment to really spend time and look at each individual piece, and they're not competing with each other. as you go through the space. He wanted his galleries to be a liminal space. And liminal is a word that I really like for this, because basically the word means it's occupying a position at both sides of a boundary or a threshold. It's about kind of being a transitional space. And he saw this as being a transitional space between the material world of being in New York and the spiritual, between the everyday bustle and providing this kind of contemplative space in which you can encounter art. So going back to this particular image, you can see he includes some greenery. He's trying to include nature to really provide this soothing environment in which to explore and understand these works of modern art. He was trying to provide a space that was almost religious in nature, spiritual in nature, to kind of give you this kind of experience of walking maybe into a small chapel. I mean, he talks about his gallery as a little altar in the heart of the city. So you can see that there's a spiritual component here for sure. And there are some main ideas that he communicated about his gallery that he tried to put in his exhibition pamphlets. He wanted the work of these artists to be available to both the wealthy and the people who couldn't pay much, as I said, but truly loved and understand the work. And so there's a great story that's kind of worth telling at length for this, just so you kind of get an idea of his ethos. I'm going to read it to you. A plain, shabbily dressed girl had come into room 303. She had talked to O'Keeffe once before when she had been there, and had said she wanted a Marin, and this is an artist named John Marin. She said she'd wanted a Marin, although she had little money. While the girl was in there today, in walked O'Keeffe and said, "Oh, there's the girl who wants a Marin." Stieglitz said to her, "Do you want a Marin?" And the girl said fervently, "Oh, yes." Stieglitz saw she had little and asked her how much she wanted to spend. She said, "$50. $5 is all I have now, but I'll send you the remainder from time to time, and then when it's all paid for, you send me the picture." Stieglitz showed her various Marins priced at about $350, $250, and $175. And O'Keeffe pulled out a really fine artist Marin, meaning a really expensive one, right? And she says, "How do you like this one?" "Oh, I love that," said the girl, her face lighting up. "Do you really love that?" "Oh, yes," said the girl. "Well, you shall have that," said Stieglitz. Then tears came into the girl's eyes, and everyone in the room was moved. "I've never made a fool of myself before when I bought anything," said the girl. "You're not buying anything," said Stieglitz. And the unknown girl carried off under her arm a fine Marin watercolor, her name unknown and her address unnoted. "That's what's called a sale here," was Stieglitz's comment. The girl who bought the Marin for $5 the week before came up to Stieglitz to give him another $5. "That was the greatest thing that's ever happened in my life," said the girl. "As I look at the Marin each day, I see new things in it. It grows more and more beautiful." And Stieglitz said, "It was one of the finest things that has happened in my life, too, one of the biggest things that has happened in this room." He opened his purse to show the girl the $5 bill she had given. "It will never be used," said Stieglitz. So Stieglitz takes this account down, right? And he demonstrates in this account that his desire to cultivate really authentic aesthetic experience overrode commercial interests for him. And what is more, he's intentionally aware of the effect that promoting this kind of mentality had on the onlookers. And he really talks in his writings and multiple interviews about this idea of a democratic art, that an art that is available to all members of society. And in multiple interviews, he's going to emphasize this, that this sentiment that's delineated in this story of this girl, that art should be accessible to those who want it most, regardless of their financial ability. So he's going to work to promote artists, he's going to provide artists stipends, and he's going to be constantly in the public, trying to get the public familiar with current and modern art. I want to show you how his own photography began to change from pictorialism to straight photography, which straight photography means no manipulation whatsoever. You take the image and then you develop it, and that's it, right? And so Here you can see the steerage is an image on a ship, and on the upper level you have the more upper members of society, and on the bottom level you have the people who couldn't pay as much for transatlantic tickets, that kind of thing. But you can see the difference in just how these images look, right? You can see the pictorial image is softer. It's a more kind of traditional artistic vantage point and a more traditional subject. It's a landscape with a building in it. And straight photography begins to try to depict the world around you and do so with clarity and emphasize various linear and geometric elements, which you can also see in the incorporation of the gangplanks here, the stairs, the smokestack, really calling attention to the aesthetics of what it's like to be on a ship. He was very, very active in endorsing photography, and in fact, he'd become so known for his work in endorsing photography that an artist named Francis Picabia created this image portrait. It's called This is Stieglitz Here in 1915. And so basically what he's doing is saying, and titling it This is Stieglitz Here, that Stieglitz and his camera were one and the same. They're mutually interchangeable. You see other elements here. Underneath this is Stieglitz Here in French, you see faith and love, and then 291, symbolic of his gallery. And that this is also a little bit of satire, right? And that you have this camera, the bellows are kind of flopped over. There's a joke about Stieglitz being old and that kind of representing a dilapidated phallus, if you will. But above the aperture, right, above the lens, you see letters, and those letters read ideal. And so what Picabia is really kind of saying here is that Stieglitz has this immense ideal and that he may not ever reach it, right, with his own work, but that he strives and strives to reach the ideal, what could be perfect in photography. And I think you can make the case even for his gallery work as well and his promotion of artists. Just to show you a couple of other images of his. Here's the City of Ambition. This is taken from a ferry as you're leaving New York. And you see these newly built skyscrapers rising above the harbor. And for Stieglitz, skyscrapers were symbols of both the physical magnificence of the city and what he disparaged as this human ambition that was constantly moving. But he's, thinking about, in titling this work, this title, City of Ambition, and showing the skyscrapers in all their glory with smoke coming out of them, he's focusing up, right, towards the sky as a reminder of, the possible transcendence of our shortcomings, being able to get past human failings and see what a city can truly become, or what art can allow us to become, I guess is another way to look at that. I want to show you these because I just love these photographs as well. These are from his Equivalent series, and basically what he did is he took his camera and he photographed clouds. And here, what he's really doing, nobody had photographed clouds like this before, because clouds are constantly moving and difficult to capture without getting blurry, and getting the right kind of focus here is really key. But notice how he takes out any other referent. You're only looking at the clouds. They look like they could almost be abstract paintings, right? These are images that he'll be consumed with for over a decade, these images of clouds. And he took them with his Graflex camera, which is a little camera that you held down at the belly and you looked through the viewfinder to see out of. And so this series is all about the equivalent to what he was feeling. So how to convey an equivalent of what's ultimately something without words, thinking about the equivalent of spiritual matters, because he's taking images of the heavens. But it's a sequence of cloud portraits with these endlessly shifting patterns, densities of clouds, different luminosities. The sun is hitting at different levels. There's these variations of light and shadow. And when he's talking about the equivalents, he's using clouds as equivalents of kind of transitory mental or emotional states, right? The series of moods that he's depicting. And the correlation between nature and inner states of being is key for Stieglitz. You really have to look at these closely. They're small. They're about 4 by 5 inches. And because of the print method, these gelatin silver prints, they kind of have a holographic sheen to them. And he said, when he's talking about these, he said, some people feel as if I have photographed God. Maybe I have. And it's hard for us to understand how remarkable they really were, but Stieglitz, in capturing clouds like this for the first time and removing all grounding elements, there are no trees, no horizon lines, they become these kind of spiritual stand-ins, these kind of abstract images that convey maybe these deeper ideals or deeper states of being. So I wanted to show you what Stieglitz was doing and how he was really avant-garde in his own right as being a photographer. But as I said at the beginning, I really want to kind of talk about how he was this tentpole central figure for American modernism. He took a number of photos of his friends and fellow artists, including Georgia O'Keeffe, who he eventually married. And here you can see her standing on the left in front of one of her paintings, and then on the right, I just love this image because it's cute. Anyway, so let's talk about Georgia O'Keeffe now for a little bit. She was one of the earliest artists in America to experiment with abstract or purely non-representational art. I have to give a shout out to Texas because this particular painting of hers on the right is at the Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, and she actually spent a good deal of time out in Texas. At the beginning of her career, she taught art out at West Texas A&M in the early 19-teens, but most people think of her, if you think of her at all, as dealing with the West. That's going to be a little later in her career. We'll talk about New Mexico in a little bit. But here maybe you can see how she will become so indebted to Kandinsky with his emphasis on the emotional and the spiritual importance of form and color. So she has a lot of different influences. She studied under Arthur Wesley Dow, who taught at Columbia Teachers College in New York City, who was really interested in Japanese art and woodblock prints and patterns. And O'Keeffe talks about how important he was for her and how he taught her to, quote, fill space in a beautiful way, quote. And so you'll see her really begin to take these lessons and apply them. And just incidentally for Stieglitz, O'Keeffe was one of the first true American artists because she'd never been to Europe. And so her work was rooted in the soil of America as he saw it. So she takes the rules that she learns from Kandinsky and that she learns from Arthur Wesley Dow, and she begins to translate recognizable imagery and break it down into formal compositions, as you can see here. This is a flower, a red canna, that she has basically zoomed in so far on that it has become almost abstract. Let's look at another one here. Now, a jack in the pulpit is a flower as well, which you can see here. But she really strips the flower to its purest forms and colors to really heighten its expressive power. If you look at this, she is reducing the curved planes and the contours of the flower to colors and forms almost to the point of complete abstraction. And she returns to this a few different times. This is obviously number 4. I'll show you some of her other iterations of the Jack in the Pulpit. These are all of this one flower, okay? Go back to this one. She was very influenced by modern photography and its ability to zoom in and to crop images. She said, "It's only by selection, by elimination, by emphasis that we get at the real meaning of things." So what she's doing here, she takes this flower, she zooms in, she fills the entire canvas and removes any other identifying contexts, right? This is a large canvas. This painting is filled with this one detail of a flower. So these flowers begin to kind of have these monumentality. She talked about how she wanted to make the citizens of New York stop and look at the flower too. She said, I will arrest the New Yorkers with the sight of a flower. And that's really what she does here. And you can see, I just want you to think about looking at this, her mature work, whether it's flowers or skyscrapers, as we'll look at in a second, or cow skulls, they all fall under this style called precisionism, because you can see the detail and the clarity of line and shape and color that she uses. So she actually kind of reveals this organic reality of the flower by underscoring its characteristic features. What are Jack in the Pulpits known for? I'm going to go here again so you can see it. But as this very distinct shape and color, right? So she's trying to get at the ordinary essence of the thing, as she would say. So she's, in a way, she's doing what Duchamp does, right? She's taking ordinary, everyday things and making us look at them in a completely new way. So one of the things she's known for are these flowers, and she returns to them time and time again because they are so different from life in the urban environment. But she did begin to chafe a little bit that, all of the men thought that, her male artists and the critics and whatever thought that the flowers were such an amazing subject matter, especially because she was female, right? There was this idea about femininity in the flower. And so basically she begins to work in the city, and she got really tired of everybody reading her work purely in terms of her gender or sexuality. So in the mid-20s, while walking around New York one evening, she saw what she described to be a sky shape made by buildings. And so she began to think about what it would be like to paint buildings, which was considered to be a more masculine subject matter. And a lot of people said, no, don't do that. You should stick to flowers. But essentially, she thumbed her nose at them. And one of her first skyscraper paintings sat in Stieglitz's gallery and sold for a large amount of money on one of the first days it was exhibited. And so she said that after that, nobody really objected to her painting buildings. But this one is one of my absolute favorites. It's called The Shelton with Sunspots. The Shelton is an apartment building in New York, and it's where she actually lived with Stieglitz once they got married. But it was a totally new building design. You can get into the kind of zoning laws of New York as they're trying to figure out how to deal with these ever-rising skyscrapers. But you have this kind of step-back design that was intended through zoning laws to let in more sunlight onto the city streets. But notice what she's done here. She's really putting in photographic elements. There are aberrations, these sunspots, things that would happen when you're pointing your camera directly at the sun, that gives it this kind of ethereal and mystical quality. And incidentally, the sun is kind of positioned right on around the 30 to 33rd floor, which is pretty much where she and Stieglitz lived together. But you have the focuses on these buildings, giving them kind of an iconic quality. And I also just want to call our attention again to this rising smoke, that there is a very propitious feel, that this image is in a way full of hope. And she was raised going to a number of different churches, but one of the churches was the Catholic Church, and she talks about the rising of incense being really formative for her, and that what is incense but the kind of physical representation of prayers rising to heaven. And so I think that's kind of an interesting spiritual element to this, because you have this kind of I don't know, have you guys seen Sword in the Stone, the old Disney movie, when the little boy King Arthur pulls the sword from the stone and the light shines down and glitter and heaven is singing? It's kind of a similar moment here, right? So I want you to think about that and think about how what she's doing, she's really focusing on the modern urban environment and trying to encapsulate, just like Joseph Stella did, how it feels to walk through the city streets and what it feels like to be in Manhattan amongst these larger than life buildings. Also wanted to just show you this one. This is one of my favorite ones. The Radiator Building at Night. She talked about this new building that was designed by an architect named Raymond Hood, and she said that she just had to paint it. She absolutely just had to paint it. And so it's kind of difficult to see in this image of it, but the sign on the left says Alfred Stieglitz in the red. But the original sign actually read Scientific American, which was a popular magazine at the time. But you have this beacon of modernity that's marked by Alfred Stieglitz, so I think that's important to kind of note. But again, look at that rising plume of smoke. Look at the lights. There's something very religious in the way that she treats this, but also just the colors and the contrast here is absolutely stunning. And so I'll finish talking about O'Keeffe by looking at this particular image. Basically, in the 1930s, her relationship with Stieglitz was very tumultuous. He could be amazing. He could also be a real butthead, and that's the scientific term for that, right? But so they had a very tumultuous marriage, and she began going out to the New Mexico desert, where she found restoration. And after Stieglitz's death, she would eventually move out there. She had a property near Abiquiu called Ghost Ranch, and she would just go out into the New Mexico desert and paint the mesas and whatnot. But this particular painting, I think, is remarkable, and it kind of is a turning point in her focus of her career, that she'll begin to focus on these desert themes. But she had seen her life grow increasingly kind of barren in the city, and she was looking for some kind of rejuvenation. And as she goes out to the desert, she finds these symbols, and she kind of does this mystical, almost surreal depiction of this ram's head skull as it floats in the air, suspended above the desert. And a lot of people in the past, when she exhibited it, and even today, talk about this as ultimately being a painting about death. But I think we can read a little bit more into it, and especially thinking about the time frame, 1935, we're in the middle. We've seen the absolute worst of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. And so you have these themes that are going through America. Remember, you can never take an artwork out of context. You have to think about that. And so, sure, we have an image of a dead skull. Sure, we have a kind of barren landscape, so to speak. But what do you do with the flower? And I think one of the things that you take from that is that there is beauty and that there is rejuvenation. And she really liked this quote by a fellow artist who we're going to talk about in a second, named Marston Hartley, who talked about how this painting was all about transformation and ultimately about hope. And so I think that's, you have to really put all the elements together to take a look at what she's actually trying to say. So with this, I want to transition to another artist that was in and around Stieglitz at the time, and he's also a precisionist. If we looked at Georgia O'Keeffe being a precisionist, painting these incredibly crisp, readable paintings, right? Charles Demuth is an artist who was from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he was really shaped by European modernism. As a youth, he had trained at the Pennsylvania Academy of Art, and then he actually went to Paris in 1907, where he met several leaders of the modernist movement at Gertrude Stein's house, including Matisse and Braque. He discovered Cézanne. And so he begins to work on his compositions and reduce his forms to a series of planes that was impacted by Cezanne. And he returned to New York, and he became friends with Stieglitz and his circle, and then also with Marcel Duchamp in the Arnsberg circle around Duchamp. And he began to paint still lives and other things in watercolor. And he even talked about the medium of watercolor being so important to him because of its precisionist qualities. Most of his paintings, even if he's working in oil, apply this very precise, pristine aesthetic to them. And he's going to take ideas from Cubism, which you can see here, maybe a little bit of the fractured visual language of Cubism and the dynamism of Futurism, and apply it to very distinctive American places like cities and factories. In 1921, however, he was diagnosed with diabetes, and his health grew so poor that he actually had to move back to his hometown of Lancaster to be taken care of by his mom. And so we didn't have the kind of knowledge of diabetes back then that we do now, unfortunately, and his health was never really back, although he was one of the first people to try insulin injections, which actually saved his life. He was probably going to die immediately, which helped, but he did eventually die of complications from diabetes in 1935. But let's look at this particular work, My Egypt. This is one of his masterworks. And here, what are we looking at? He directs our gaze upwards toward these massive volumes of a concrete silo that totally fills the canvas. So My Egypt is depicting this steel and concrete grain elevator in his hometown of Lancaster. And you have the clean lines of precisionism with these intersecting diagonal planes that add a sense of movement and monumentality to the structure. So you can also see this massive smokestack and a kind of heavenly radiance to the composition, bringing to mind, the correlations between modernity and industry and religion that we've all talked about in the 1920s. Something that's also emphasized here by the low vantage point, like you're looking up at it, right? And including the lower rooftops of neighboring buildings at the bottom of the painting. But why do you think it's called My Egypt? This is really part of his search for meaning and for his identity in the American landscape. So while we can think about it being positive and almost reminiscent of a stained glass window, you also have to dive deeper into some of the more negative correlations too. There's a bit of understated irony here. He had been forced, not really even decided, he was forced to really return home following this exhilarating life in Europe and New York, and it must have been a pretty bitter pill to swallow, right? And so you can see this almost as being in terms of the biblical exile of the Jews in Egypt, waiting for their time to get back to the promised land. So there's that kind of illusion when he's saying My Egypt, this is my exile. And here you have this majestic grain elevator that's rising up as this pinnacle of American achievement. It's a modern day equivalent to the monuments of ancient Egypt, but nonetheless he may have, intended the title to allude to the slave labor that built the pyramids, or talking about the kind of dehumanizing effect of industry on the nation's workers. And also, if you think about, Egypt being known primarily for the pyramids, right? Not all, obviously, but primarily. The pyramids and their association with life after death might have been appealing to him. He was bedridden with diabetes at the time of making this painting. So it's a really kind of ambivalent image. It's about exile and alienation and this industrial presence in America, but it's also about this kind of aesthetic admiration for the forms. It's this towering icon of American ingenuity that's flooded with light from above. And so you'll see him turn to this aesthetic and turn to this ambivalence time and time again with a number of these works of kind of smokestacks and American industry paintings. But I want to shift and talk about another really important body of work that he completed during these years that's largely influenced by his interaction with other artists and poets and poets being key here. This idea about wordplay and interest in symbols and double entendre, double meaning. And so he completed what he called poster portraits. There are 8 of them between 1924 and 1929, and they're tributes to American artists, writers, and performers. He did one of Georgia O'Keeffe, another one of Dove and Hartley, other members of the Secret Circle, and another one of poet Wallace Stevens, playwright Eugene O'Neill. And this particular one is in honor of his long, deep, and very sweet friendship with the poet William Carlos Williams. Williams is a very amazing poet, but he's also a doctor, and he helped to ease Dimas' physical ailments during this period. And so they had a lot to talk about, whether it was art or poetry, but also he helped him, visited him in Lancaster and helped him with his diabetes, which is part of their relationship. But Williams wrote a poem called The Great Figure after seeing a red fire engine with the number 5 that was emblazoned on the side roaring past him in the night on the streets of New York. And basically, he was walking down 9th Avenue in New York City on his way to Marsden Hartley, another painter, his studio, and he heard the noises of a fire truck only to turn around just as it was going by. And so all he saw in the blur was the number of the truck, this 5 that was painted in gold on a red background that was speeding past. And at this moment in his career, Williams was trying to create poems that were precise and concrete representations of felt experiences. So here I'll just show you the poem. Among the rain and lights, I saw the figure 5 in gold on a red fire truck, moving, tense, unheeded, to gong clangs, siren howls, and wheels rumbling through the dark city. So here you have this juxtaposition, right? The poem itself is pretty straightforward, but Dimas' painting is more complicated. You really need to kind of know the poem to decode the painting. And so you have this setting in being almost a tunnel-like street, where you have sidewalks and buildings, and much of the backdrop is gray and black, but you have illuminated shop windows on the side and street lamps on both sides, and you have the red fire truck that is dominating the middle of the composition. And even though its form is abstracted, you can kind of recognize it by its red color, right? You can see the truck's ladder on the right, and then the wheel axles stretching across the bottom, and roaring sirens. And so you have these little curved lines that radiate from those sirens, which can indicate sound or motion or both or whatever. But Dimas is dividing the picture plane into rectangles and triangles, refracting light, changing the color of space and shapes. And so you have these diagonal lines that force your eyes to really race around as you're trying to understand the image. And then you have the number 5 that repeats itself very clearly 3 times in the center of the composition, and they get larger as they surge into the foreground or smaller as they recede into the background, whichever way you want to look at it. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can even see the glimpse of the curve of a 4th 5 as it's, imagining what it would have been like seeing that, a really large 5 as it races past you. And here you can also see at the very bottom, WCW, those are William Carlos Williams' initials, and then his nickname Bill is cropped at the top, and his middle name Carlos is on a skyscraper in the back with the S hidden behind another building. But these references to Williams aren't terribly obvious, though, and they only make sense if you already know to associate Williams with this painting. And so these poster portraits that Dimas makes function as graphic advertisements for their sitters, but they also include puns or inside jokes that Dimas' friendships with his subjects evoke in more subtle ways. They're sweet and kind of sentimental in a way, but also I want us to think about him calling these poster portraits. Posters are not recognizable as high art forms, right? Or they haven't been traditionally. And so you think about this modern moment, and you think about how Demuth is tapping into things like found objects and posters that are blurring the lines between, quote, high art and low art, and trying to draw associations between his work and low art, mass media, mass production, all of that. And I think that's all really, really relevant here. So I want to finish today by talking about this. This is another non-representational portrait from a little bit earlier by the artist Marsden Hartley. And he was also in the Stieglitz Circle. He was from Maine, and he came to Stieglitz's attention in about 1907 because of a series of landscapes of Maine that he had done that were shown then later in the 291 galleries in 1909. But basically, Stieglitz encouraged him to travel, and from 1912 to 1915 he lived abroad in Europe, where he met Gertrude Stein again, and then moved to Berlin, where he came into the orbit of Kandinsky and the Blue Rider Group, and he was really inspired by their focus on mysticism and on emotional expression. And here we have his portrait of a German officer from 1914. So what's going on in 1914 but World War I? And so this is a portrait that, again, doesn't actually include the person, but is identifying this German officer by a series of their accoutrement or their signifying elements, whatever you want to say. But so here, what do we see? We see German flags, military insignia, spurs from boots, tassels from uniforms, numbers, the German cross, and then in the back, a kind of checkerboard pattern. And this is a coded portrait of Hartley's friend and probable lover, Karl von Freiberg, a German officer who was killed on the Western Front. And here you can see his initials on the bottom left, Karl von Freiberg, and the number 4, which is his regiment. And the checkerboard even signifies his love of chess. 24 at the bottom right was the age at which he died, and then the Iron Cross, which is the award that he received posthumously after he had died. But basically, Portrait of a German Officer is a really good example, as is Demuth's portrait paintings, portrait posters, of this abstraction of ideas. It's clear that Hartley is using elements from Picasso's Cubism and German Expressionists. He's not depicting what von Freiberg looked like, but he's trying to make a portrait that alludes to who and what he was. This painting brings together a bunch of different real-world objects in a manner that kind of emulates Cubist still lifes, right? Of deconstructing three-dimensional forms and reassembling them on a two-dimensional canvas. And then if you want to think about how he's reflecting Kandinsky using bright colors, dynamic linear forms, who's, if you're thinking about Kandinsky, who was developing a painterly language of pure form and color that's designed to elicit emotional responses from the viewer. So Hartley is taking all of these ideas together and using these new modes of abstraction to depict his idea of who this person was. So in doing this, he's basically kind of fundamentally shifting the nature and the function of the traditional portrait. And it's also more than just a portrait of the individual. It is expressing to what it's like to be in Germany at this time, this rising German nationalism that he witnessed while living in Berlin. And he actually got in trouble for this painting back in the States in 1916 because this painting was seen as really kind of too pro-German by a lot of folks in the middle of the war. But I hope that all of these images that we've looked at today can help you understand what it was like to exist in the world as an American artist at the turn of the 20th century, and what's happening as these modern currents are making their way across the Atlantic, and what kind of themes and what interests American artists visually, and how this has been impacted by not just the Armory show, but of these signature players like Duchamp and Stieglitz as we move forward. So we'll take a look at what's happening in America around World War II in our next lecture. But I hope that this has introduced you to these artists, because they're some of my favorites, And that, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and email me. Have a good week, you guys.